Welcome everybody, welcome ladies and gentlemen to our Irish language seminar tonight. My name is Natalie Nugent-O'Shea. I'm the Executive Director of the Celtic Junction Arts Centre, which is bringing you this program. And in here, you can see I am in the beautiful Eoin McKiernan Library. The library is one of our programs with Celtic Junction Arts Centre. The other three are the Irish College of Minnesota, the concert series, and of course our outreach programming. We bring you this program by virtue of all of them coming together. It is my pleasure to welcome you to an exciting evening and to tell you a little bit about how it will go. What we'll begin with is a presentation by the lovely Lavinia Finnerty. We will move on to a panel discussion with Lavinia and include Irish language speakers and instructors, Fintan Moore and Nancy Stenson. And at the end, of course, we will welcome your questions and comments. So get ready to put your Irish on. But first, we have this lovely exhibition due to a generous loan from the Consulate General of the Midwest. So in order to kick off this event, it is my great pleasure to introduce Miss Sarah Keating, Vice Consul General.
Good evening. Athbheochan. Tá Anna Áhar very client living up. I'm delighted to join you to introduce tonight's presentation. Sarah Keating is anam dom, agus Tom in my last consul ag an Ord Consulate na Éire in Chicago. My name is Sarah Keating and I'm the current Vice Consul at Ireland's Consulate General in Chicago. Although I cannot be with you in person this evening, I'm delighted to have been asked to be a part of this event. I studied the Irish language in university, and during that time was lucky enough to complete an internship with Conradh na Gaeilge, and the teaching and celebration of the Irish language is something that remains very close to my heart today. As you will hear throughout the evening, in 2018, Conradh na Gaeilge celebrated its 125th anniversary, and a bilingual exhibition was developed in celebration of this. We've been delighted to share this exhibition with our cultural and academic partners across the Midwest, and it has now happily found its way to a new home at the Celtic Junction Arts Centre in St. Paul. The exhibition celebrates one of the core purposes of Conradh na Gaeilge, the revival, or Os Gaeilge Athbheochan, of the Irish language through culture, community, and much more. When sitting down to begin the revival over 125 years ago, I wonder if the founders could have foreseen that over a century later, the Irish language would be taught as far away as Minnesota in the Midwest of the US, and indeed even further afield today. The work being done by Lavinia and others at Celtic Junction in teaching and celebrating the Irish language goes straight to the heart of what Conradh na Gaeilge aimed to achieve. The Irish language plays such an important role in Irish culture, and it is inspiring to see it being embraced more today, both at home and by our diaspora throughout the world. A special thank you to Natalie O'Shea for inviting me to be a part of tonight's event, and to Lavinia Finnerty for both her presentation this evening and her work in keeping the Irish language alive and well in the Midwest. I hope you all enjoy what I'm sure will be a fantastic presentation. Gurv Magat agus Athbheochan.
Thank you so much, Sarah, for your generous words and for your recognition of the center here. Now, of course, it's my pleasure to introduce you to one of my favorite people in this world. She's one of the instructors in the Irish language here at the Irish College of Minnesota. She has brought the TEG program to our shores. We're one of the few places that actually hosts that Irish language certification through the University of Maynooth. The chair of our department and native of Connemara, Ireland, Miss Lavinia Finnerty.
But as you see here on the left of the screen, you see the picture of Daniel O'Connell, and he was a fantastic man with that. However, when it came to the Irish language, and the Irish language is our topic tonight, he had some, you know, an dearcha bhí aige le teanga bhí sé cinál ní raibh sé có dearfach le teanga bhí sé sásta scuile leis teanga. So he wasn't as pro the Irish language. I suppose if you really look back at it, he saw you know, human rights as a bigger issue than the language. Okay, so this is one of the things that people often maybe bring up today, and this maybe he's looked upon as a black mark on his reputation culturally towards the language. So really second. So she an Gerta Moore, but an Gerta Moore an ceangan rudí a tháinig as a Gerta Moore nó an eis imirce agus an méadthó a hála sa tír. So really the mass immigration that occurred in that century, and not only that, the education system, the introduction of the national schools in 1831 was a huge factor, because this really, Corshid Cusk Umlan Erin Gaeilge, there was a huge absolute they wanted to really stop the language and the development of the language. So when they wanted to introduce an education system, they introduced it 100% in English. And so an rud a bhí an nó ní raibh áit a bith ag an Gaeilge. Ní raibh áit a bith ag an Gaeilge, ní raibh spás go hifigiúil go Gaeilge is sa síl gnó, agus sin an rud a bhí siad a gur chuir trasna. Agus sin ceangan na faibaní tá fós linne le teanga an dearcha is an mion sin. So one of the big things that came out of that century was the whole attitude towards the Irish language. And unfortunately, it's the negative language on that side of it is one of the things we still are left with today. They're not that there wasn't enough that Irish wasn't good enough. It wasn't a language meant for business. That it was that the education that people wanted to educate their children through the medium of English. For example, where I grew up in Rosmuck Connemara, we, you know, there's a place called Athbheochan, or Peacocks of Mam Cross, and we had a saying at home that the so if you go past Mam Cross, what good is it to you? So that mentality stayed, but it didn't just stay. Sunkery Bavasis dói or he've untangod that mindset towards the language stayed, and so that was really one we've had to work very hard at to try and shake that off. So, and really when you look at it, was why the acquisition of English overwhelmingly meant the abolishment of the Irish. When you look at it, that's actually a fantastic question, but you have to look at also of the psychological and social and the issues that had happened prior to this, okay? And we can't only imagine what they all went through at this time. So, but the mockery from that century did last. And it was one of the things that, and it wasn't just from outside, it also occurred from inside. And it was one of the things that people going forward, they wanted to kind of work at improving, and the vision of revival came. So in the 1880s, there was Aontacht na Gaeilge was set up, of course, and of course they did very well because they did manage to do was introduce the they got permission to actually publish Irish Gaeilge, and that was a big deal because up till then, people who had been, the education system had only focused on English. If you were caught speaking Irish, there was punishments involved, quite severe punishments in some of the schools actually. So the whole idea that Aontacht na Gaeilge was able to get was able to be allowed to publish a magazine was a huge deal. But even though that happened, they still saw that they had a lot of work to do, and that wasn't enough, and that really one own híide thug siad faoi dara gur has the níos mó cansóirí ilya tanga has to béim agus bura curfuí na cansóirí dúcha sé ví sa tír, mar hic siad gur a mea tarlú. So they understood that there had been a decline in the 19th century in native speakers, and they understood the need for increasing speakers throughout the country. And they understood that if you have just literature on its own is not enough. That mar tanga be near war be ó riamh nar war costal in the tucha. And that's so true, that any language that hasn't survived by the fireside, it will not survive, because having literature in a library is not enough. You need to have the people speaking it. And thankfully we're blessed here really to have the community we have with us. And mar dúirt Douglas, ní léon níor be is smooth hastal it done in this no real mass na wini. So the main thing that was needed was to keep the people speaking. And actually, if you look at where the language is today, we're still saying the same thing in some parts. However, we'll come to that later on in our discussion about the state of the language today. So tunkruk is takiok do verica. Conran na Gaeilge, nuair a buniú Conran na Gaeilge. When you see dulcan cín iontocha dosach sna carthacha. So mar hampla London agus sna carthacha timpeall na Crinne. So it really, it did very well when they set up, when Conran na Gaeilge was set up in 1891. Or 1893, excuse me, in July of 1893. And when it was set up, after it being set up, they did very well. They struggled a bit in Ireland first, but they did very well in the urban areas, and even in London. And that's where for example, one of the people who became very involved in Conran na Gaeilge was actually an English woman, Norma Rothwick, and she actually found out about Conran na Gaeilge in London, and she actually came to Dublin and worked with Conran na Gaeilge, the Gaelic League in Dublin. And as she did, it grew and it grew, although it didn't grow overnight. It had its challenges, really, so it did. But one of the things that happened was they Hosashid Shgame Timri, and they started the teachers, the traveling teachers on the road, to encourage people to awaken the interest of the language in the people and to get the people speaking Irish. And actually, when we look at this, we have to really think of one man in particular. We have to think of Thomas Bán Ó Concannon. And Thomas Bán Ó Concannon, if I was to go back to that time, he would be the one I would want to chat with, to be honest. Far at Inish Meán Áran, chuig bliain a déag, thuaidh sé go medical in the Rochad. Agus, so when he was 15, he went to America with his brother, and he actually ended up going to college in New York, and he got a master's in accountancy. And after getting the master's in accountancy, he actually ended up selling rubber stamps, believe it or not, at the time. And then he ended up going to California to his brother's vineyard, actually. So he had a very interesting life, and he worked for a while in his brother's vineyard. After working there, he went down to Mexico, and whilst in Mexico, he came across a pamphlet belonged to Conran na Gaeilge, and then along he ended up coming back home. He actually, remember now, at the time when he grew up on the Aran Islands, there was no this education. The available there was just through English. So remember, he had never read or written in Irish. So he learned how to read and write in Irish he taught himself. So for all you learners out there, now he was a native, to have that to his advantage, but he taught himself how to read and write Irish after getting the pamphlet from Conran na Gaeilge in Mexico. Okay, but his journey doesn't stop there. He came home to Ireland again on holidays, and that's when he met Pádraig Mac Piarais. And Pádraig Mac Piarais went to the islands, went to visit him on the island, and from there they set up the first branch of Conradh na Gaeilge on the islands. And that would have been the first, one of the main things was to introduce education trí Gaeilge. Now remember, when all of this was being done, it was considered illegal. So they hadn't permission to do all of this. So sometimes there was obstacles in their way, and not only the obstacles of from English rule, but also some people were not interested. Now in the Gaeltacht they were quite lucky, because obviously you would be interested in it, but as they went on through their time, they did come across many an obstacle. So they did. Thomas Vaughan O'Concannon, he actually stayed in Ireland. Dan Chesmale, he didn't return back to Mexico, but he became one of the Timri Conradh na Gaeilge, so he became one of the main teachers of the language, traveling around the country, and it was a vocation really as much as anything else. So he actually paid himself for his business. He could afford to do it himself initially for free, and eventually they gave him a salary in doing so. But he really motivated others as going forward. And so he did. He had a huge influence on the Timris, and really one cannot think of those people who went around and to, not only did they stir up the language, they tried to, I suppose there was a nationalism they were trying to awaken in the people as well, So as they were doing that, Thomas Vaughan O'Concannon, befar ussel agus soi olwar ilye on scheme seo. He was huge in this scheme for it to be successful. There is no doubt about that. And ní upper éisce on will said maar so it really, they had challenges in front of them at many points. So actually so mar dúirt Padre O'Hanachran dúirt go meisceal colm ó gcuire Thomas go le brathúir in isise dasach but vinnig nar bíon áilsa curtí rive nuair a héoch sé a críomhscaoile soscail an Conradh in áit. So when he would go spreading the news, really it was like soscail. It was like, I suppose in many ways he was preaching the story and trying to promote the language and trying to awaken this in the people. And really by 1906 there was actually they had grown. So from starting off with Thomas Vaughan, by the time they got to 1906 they had 100 teachers going around the countries so they had so agus Éireachas. Now as we look at the education, so we already mentioned a little bit about the influence of the national schools and the national school really Cursheed Cusk or in Gaeilge, so they really limited. There was not a place for the Irish language there, but so really they had they were the ones really who Conradh na Gaeilge, the Gaelic League, were the ones who began the teaching of Irish language the first day ever really in the island in this period of time. Okay, and they had huge obstacles to overcome, but really one of the things that they were, one of the goals they had was that every person would get to speak the language, so they would. And now they were, they really they had that goal. Now, sin ráitse, agus lean siad a rai, agus nuair and as they continued, they had many emphases, but however, so first off, when they started off, they were aiming at the whole island. So, they really, after the Free State being developed, they actually left Northern Ireland out, and that was actually one of the I suppose if I was to be critical of Conradh na Gaeilge today, not that I am, because I understand that the work that they done at the time they done it, if I was to be critical of them, I suppose I would say that maybe that was a mistake, that after our Free State was established in 1922, after our War of Independence and our Civil War, that they didn't continue with the Irish in the 6 counties. That I would say is one of their I suppose as I said, their weak point, you know, or one of their I suppose maybe one of the mistakes they made, because we still have the results of that today. Because but as we look at the things that were set up by Conradh na Gaeilge, as well, they began printing books, so that was very important. They began also with so we had the education system. So as well as the education system, they developed that education system, and they set up na Scolny Savra that we know today really started with Conradh na Gaeilge. So they did, and came really the primary schools after the Free State, they had set up the education system for them, and it was really so they had really set the wheel in motion, I suppose. And then as we go on and we look at cultúras tonscolaíochta, we'll see that one of the things that they did was they began to wallis siad béileadas agus thuas siad hart agus crinne siad béileadas, and that began also that. Again, they were, I suppose, though ceann rudí a bhí iontu bar go leor valley mar siad san ó hart agus siad san a curtús leis an Athbheochan. So they were the ones who began the folklore, the collecting of the folklore and the recordings that many of us have today as a result. I remember a number of years back that I went home to Mom and I was asking her about Sean McRaymond, and I remember I was in college at the time, and I remember her answer. She turned to me, but that kind of all stemmed from Conradh na Gaeilge, and they set that in motion, I suppose. So they did. And so one of the things that they also set in motion was the fishes, and so they not only put emphasis on the language, they included it as part of the culture, agus on culture, agus ag Iireachtas na Gaeilge, féle mór na Gael, a chur Conradh na Gaeilge ar bun an 1897, bín breis is 10 míle a láthair gach bliain, but tá sé sin có fíor in jobh sa bhí sé an tamsin. So one of the biggest celebrations we have, I suppose, the Oscars of the Irish language, occurs at Iireachtas na Gaeilge every year. And that is held the last week in October each year. And that's something that was set up by Conradh na Gaeilge. So it was in 1987, but that still continues to this day. And in the library, actually, we have in the library, we have actually copies of the essays that were written from that time that we will see in a while. So for example, last week in our Circle Cora, we actually spent the time talking about about this year's Oireachtas. Now, due to the pandemic, it did not go ahead this year. It was supposed to be in Galway, but it will move on to Kerry next year. So it's held in various locations. But people, if you were to recommend somebody to go to an Irish language festival, that's the one to go to. Oireachtas na Gaeilge, Oireachtas na Saona. So by sé Éire an Cibhlí an eile. So it'll be in Kerry next year. So like Cúna Zéib go maim mud sig on. And so, aine gur bíad muintir na Gaeltachta, tobar na Gaeilge, is crántacha ar gultar hóchas. Dinter iirecht fostiíocht is fintriocht a chrochú sa cheantar gaeltachtaí le cínsú go bhfuil todhchaí inmhairnta in anchob. Nis, that is very true, that Munster na Gaeltachta, the well of the Irish language is in the Gaeltacht. There's no question about this. But today we're back to the same conversation. So the language is improving, and it's going, it's improving constantly throughout the country and throughout the world, really. And an example of that is here in America. But if you look at Gaeltachtaí, actually it's in decline. And it brings us back to what Douglas DeHeeds said the very first day. So that would be one of the topics maybe we will chat about a bit more later on. But having said that, what Douglas DeHeeds said in 1893, that's as relevant then as today as it was then. Now, Óhíomh technoliachta. So from the point of view of technology, okay. So remember, so this Brandon was seo go seacéad de míle cainteoirí Ghaeilge sa tír an 1893. So master nach raibh léamh nó scríomh Gaeilge ag formhór acu. So again, that's back to the same point. So even though we had 710,000 language speakers, they didn't have the reading and writing, a majority of them were not able to read and write the language, even though the standard and the standard of their language was, I believe, much better probably than it is today, actually. But having said that, but one of the things that Conradh na Gaeilge done was introducing, and they started publishing books, and there's no doubt about it, but that was one of their the biggest influences they had on the language. So they hosa siad le pápar nóchtanas le rudí mar sin ach hu siad a rise very chéile go na leabhar agus sorella. So they really did have an influence on that. And as Martin O'Hain once commented, so he did that, he commented ní scríobh nóirí Gael, so it was often questioned so Pádraig Ó Conradh and Joseph McRiona are two phenomenal writers. And we are left with fantastic writings of theirs from that time. Now, Martin O'Hain, another fantastic writer, I suppose he's the James Joyce of the Irish language, really, I believe. And but he even commented, would we really have all of these books today had it not been for Conradh na Gaeilge? And he even questions, would two of the most renowned Irish language writers, would they even have written in Irish, or would they have been able to write in Irish if it was not for Conradh na Gaeilge, if it was not for the Gaelic League? You know, would they have had that avenue? Maybe they would have written, but maybe they would have written in Irish. So ní scríobh nóirí Gaeilge bheith chuntu Mara con Conradh. And that's very telling, I suppose. And I suppose in many ways that's one of the greatest compliments Conradh na Gaeilge could have ever got. And not only did they get it, but they got it from Martin O'Hain, one of the greatest authors ever to write in the language, actually. So Cuiltóirí. So nuair bunniú radio television or radio éideann in níd ag fios Deirtar ag an am go mbeadh áitán go Gaeilge is faoi neart caint sa faoi a ché sin ráitsa níor tharla sé sin, níor hit sé sin amach, bug no more. So that did not happen. So they had said in 1926, we had thought that there would be place for the Irish language in Radio Éire. But it shows that, remember, in 1922, by 1922, we had gone through our Civil War. We had gone through the War of Independence. We also went through our Civil War, short it may have been, but it was. And by 1926, we were now in control of our own destiny. And to think that even when we were in control of our own destiny, Radio Éire, the Irish language wasn't put first, even though Douglas DeHeatha did want it put there. But so when the radio channel started, Irish language really didn't have a place for it. And she'd glúiseach carta siviltochta an na Gaeltachta san seascadí a chur bura faoi rudaí. So really it took, which I find it very interesting that, you know, throughout the world there was movement, like there was a civil rights movements going on here in the States, and they went on in the Gaeltacht regions in Ireland. And to be honest, many people in the Gaeltachts didn't, in the non-speaking Irish areas, didn't even know those were going ahead. And they were actually, you know, this was obviously way before cell phones and emails and all of that, so the people wouldn't have known that it was going on. Even a documentary done recently in Kerry on TG Carrick, excuse me, even they had interviews of people at the times, and people didn't realize that maybe the gra agod I golará giri agus I gonamara agus in so that they didn't realize maybe that even inside the Gaeltachts that there were different Eide Haman, there were different risings happening, and civil rights movements occurring in each of. So it wasn't that they were all together. People were, you know, there was a movement going on and people were standing up and they were looking for rights. But as a result of all of this came Gaelte Éire, and the idea behind it was to set up businesses in the Gaeltacht regions, because economic policy that had existed for the Gaeltacht regions in our Free State, in the Republic of Ireland at that time, was immigration. We were on the western seaboard for the most part. Now, they did set up one of these Gaeltacht Rakarans na Siachadaí. So they did move people in the 30s from the Gaeltachts from Connemara and from Donegal and from Kerry to Rackharan, from Connemara go Háirithe, and then they moved people from Rackharan who were interested, and they did develop a new small Gaeltacht in that region. It was a way for them to try and increase the language, the government at the time. But however, it really, you know, throughout the land, it didn't. We had a chance to take care of it, and really an domas de Janus Neohish Zig, Vishe Fos on is so really we were still suffering the results of the damage that had been done in the 19th century, even though we were in control of our own destiny at this stage. Now, one of the things that came out of this was, I suppose, the people in the Gaeltachts began to just, you know, they started to stand up for themselves. And one of the things that came out of it was a pirate radio station. And this pirate radio station began for an hour a day inside. If any of you have ever been to Russmuck, if you go inside Michael's pub, there's a garden on the left-hand side. And it was in that garden that there was an old caravan in there, and they used to broadcast from in there an hour or two a day. And that was considered a pirate radio station. And there were people actually, there was pressure from, you know, it was considered unlawful. So remember, this was under Irish rule and this was considered unlawful. But they kept going, and in the 70s, so this happened in the early 70s, but finally we got our radio, how we have Radio na Gaeltachta today. Now we're very fortunate today. We have more than Radio na Gaeltachta. We have Radio Rira. We have 5 different radio channels and all. And I know that might sound like not a big deal, but at the time it was, because there was no representation for people who spoke the Irish language. You know, you often, you know, it's the same conversation that we hear in societies today, but it went on then. But then not only that, that led to the next movement once we got our radio, was now we want a television channel. And a television channel mightn't seem like a big deal today, but it was a big deal, and people went to prison because of this, you know, fighting for these rights. And fair play go Michael D tá picture ho an seo, but Michael D at the time was he was the minister for na Gaeltachtaí, and he actually was the one who actually launched TG Carr, what we now know, Television Gaeilge, what we now know as TG Carr. Okay, so, and I just read this part. Is Misha Sinead ni Éire, tá me ma hasaf an seo gan áras TG Carr, imel na tíre, imel na chorapa, a gríl ar Gaeltach an amara, a nocht ihe haune, ihe riochta, a nocht tosian an bhlion oer Celtach, agus a nocht tosian Sharvish Television sa tír seo, mar a nocht ihe oscailte TG Carr. That just happened in 1996. Okay, on Halloween night in 96. That's not that long ago, but that was a huge deal, so it was. And really from the point of view of the language, you know, now I know some of you there already are familiar with Ross Naroon and all of that, but it began Irish language programming, like television programming, were available continuously. It wasn't like you'd get a program here once and there and it was gone again. So the civil rights movement, so I have mentioned a bit about that, but really when you look at the recognition, so really Nira so they had no recognition in 1893. So really, Conradh na Gaeilge fought very hard to get rights for the language, and they set up, you know, the teaching, the teachers, the Timmery Gaeilge gal simple na tíre, the teachers who travelled around the country. But really, when you look at it, it wasn't until actually 2003 when the Free State actually got our own Athbheochan. So, like, when you think of that, 2003, it took us till we actually got our own language act, our own official language act. Like, that's mind-boggling. But what is even, for me, I find even sadder, and one of the reasons I often think that Conradh na Gaeilge should have kept with the whole 32 counties, was to this day, our 6 counties in the north does not have a language act. They still have quite a lot of challenges. I'll be honest with you, the best high school I ever saw in my life, I saw it in West Belfast. And the people and the students in that school had to fight so hard for it, and the work that's been done. But they've had, I mean, the challenges they've had, you know, when they started off, when the parents in that school, for example, started off in West Belfast with the children they decided in the 70s again that they were going to start this school. And the children, and they'd be around the same age of myself, and they told me, I remember Kieran telling me one day that that his mother used to cut up the cornflakes boxes so he would have a notebook to write on. And they started off and they had awful conditions, and that was in so recent. But I often feel that if Conradh na Gaeilge had stayed in Northern Ireland and stayed in the 6 counties, focused on all 32 counties, I often felt, but of course there were political implications for this at the time, as we all know. So we still have a lot of work to do. Éire an Gaeilge agus and I don't mean to be critical of that, but it's just one of the facts that we're left with. But Kahama Adval, there are chuimhnas túr an dulc an méid a rinne Conradh na Gaeilge. Ceann gan na rudaí bhú dar lumsa a daire lob ó híh chuir siad béimar an Gaeilge, siad san a crutha cinál an bunclach gon oidechas a tháinig sa Saoirstát, dail siad san na leabhra, chuir siad borra faoi ghaoiney, bhí leithid go Thomas Bán Ojibwa Culture agus iad tain is Páirc Mac Piarais is Colm ó Gaoire all of these people, you know, they set the foundation of what was to do with the language. And as a result of that, if you think of it today, that 100 books a year are published in Irish, in the Irish language. Now, a lot of those are published for, you know, between for enjoyment, but also a lot of them are published for learners. And the Scoilní Sabhra, now unfortunately a lot of the Scoilní Sabhra had to, as well as our own, and we were due to have the Seachtain and Gaeilge earlier this year, and of course we had to cancel it due to the pandemic this year. But they are things that have survived, and that is thanks to Conradh na Gaeilge, because really it was Conradh na Gaeilge that set those up the first day ever with the Timri a Galhart o What's go Hots. So they were and really, I believe they are some of the really the most, some of the really the positives that are from Conradh na Gaeilge. But not only that, to think that they're still continuing on with this work, but really it's Zeran Sin Golor Éire. Now, I know I went through that quite fast. I suppose Natalie, I'll go back now. What I want to do is I want to show you that Thomas O'Concannon, that I mentioned there earlier, that he came with the Heeds, and Douglas the Heeds and Eoin McNeill really were the founders of Conradh na Gaeilge. But they came, Thomas O'Concannon actually returned back to the States in 1905, and he went to, they both traveled around the United States, and they were really, what they were doing was raising funds to continue. But in the library, actually, we have one of the books that while Douglas Doheedsa was on this journey, he kept a diary or a journal of this tour he took. But at the time, when you think of it, they raised $20,000. That's a huge amount of money today, but at that time it was an astronomical amount of money. And actually Thomas O'Concannon came with them. And actually in 1905, we all know that the huge earthquake that happened in San Francisco, well, they had just left San Francisco 2 weeks before that earthquake. But what they done when they heard about the earthquake, they were elsewhere in America, but what they actually done, they returned to San Francisco, and they returned the money that they had gathered in San Francisco to the people, because they understood that that money back. But they continued on elsewhere in America, and they actually ended up raising £20,000, and that was a huge sum of money. So Natalie now is going to actually show us that in the library we actually have that book available in the library. So Natalie, would you be able to show us? And then just to let you know, the other but Conradh na Gaeilge, there 2 years ago, or I suppose a year and a half ago now, actually translated that book to English, and we actually have the English version as well as the Irish version. Okay, Natalie, have you got that there, Natalie? So that's it. So Mahoris go America, so my tour to America, and we have that in the library, and it's too, but Minnesota. So there's actually a chapter on everywhere he's gone, and in the book he writes about actually walking on the ice in Minnesota on the river, and it's quite phenomenal. But it's one of the, I believe it's one of the gems of the Eoin McKiernan Library that's actually here. So Mahoris go America, and as you can see there, Douglas Hyde's American Journey was the translation of that. So now, so they are really, if you're in the library, they're what I recommend. They would be, that's one of my first places to go to in the libraries, to those books. But then the other things that if you look at the other books that I mentioned, Oireachtas na Gaeilge, is that the Oireachtas one, Natalie? So we also have the essays. So we have the other, so here are some of the, should they on Irish lear? So should they on, this is actually a combination of, these are some of the volumes of the magazines that were written by Conran na Gaeilge at the time, and Irish lear na Gaeilge that was written at the time. So they're actually in the library. So they are, so they're hopefully when we'll all get out of this pandemic and this lockup with COVID, that this is one of the things you can go back and visit actually and see. And you can also see the the fish. So again, the Conran na Gaeilge, so Curshid Beamer and Gulthor Agus Aransanga, Kiongan na Valley, Rinshi Day Trid na Fishnley. So the fishes would have been a big deal. And again, this is one of the syllabuses from 1909. So you can see that this is in the library in the Eoin McKiernan Library as well, as you can see it there. Now, Natalie, as we move on, we've also, so at the time, these are actually the volume 1 and volume 2. Shadid na rudi atá on Oireachtas, Shadid na hashtí scrivu, fuin ag an Oireachtas ag an am. So see, these are some of the Dini Glock parts and Oireachtas. So the people who took part in the Oireachtas and they had to write their essays. So these are some of these in these compilations here that you can see. So Nish Bogamadurai could see on so, and they created their own handbook. So remember, they had the teachers traveling throughout the island. So the handbook of the Irish teachers, this one was written by McGinley, but they had directions for people and for the teachers. Remember that, na Timri, hosta si the mala has got Thomas O'Concannon, the Éire Héile Veda made the on the Muntsori, Will said. So as the number of teachers increased, they had directions as to how they should, what they were to do and how, Arnus Munter bit on Mons Lot on Yvonne. They set up these protocols for teachers, or these advice for teachers. Now, and so remember when Thomas Bán O'Concannon came home, one of the people who influenced Thomas Bán O'Concannon to actually go teaching was actually Pádraig Mac Piarais. And Pádraig Mac Piarais himself, we could spend a lot of time on him. It'd be very him, a man who spent a lot of time in Rasmuck, in fairness, and but Pádraig Mac Piarais was the one who convinced Thomas Bán like Oliver Moher. He was the one who convinced him to go on the road, and Thomas himself, as or Pádraig Pádraig Mac Piarais, he Corsahain, Murder Shahain, Pion Le Pargam, Minik Fashan. So he a huge character. And then actually the other book we have more books by Pádraig Mac Piarais in the library as well for when we do get back. Now, remember I mentioned earlier about a vineyard that Thomas Bán ended up in California, in Livermore in California, for those of you who are familiar with it. Well, actually that vineyard is still going today. So if you think of Inishman, go Livermore. So I mean, if you think of that, that's a bit of a deal, but that book is in the library and it's a very interesting book. So on 125 years, the vineyard are also going. So it's that's a bit of a gem in the library. I know it's on about wine. It's a bit of a different topic, but if you think of the journey at that time that Thomas Bán took, it's a very interesting journey. So now, remember, Nis Lucha Lume Vimakans fi Joseph McQuilna. So, I mean, Joseph McQuilna's work, he was one, really, I speak about Martin O'Hain. Okay, I'm biased. Martin O'Hain is from Connemara, and I believe he was a phenomenal writer, but Joseph McQuilna was another fantastic writer of his time, and he would have been up there with one of the best writers that came from Ulster, from Ranferrish actually. He's from a Johnny Gallman, but but this here, some of samples of his work can be also seen in the library, as can I also mentioned. Now remember, I mentioned Joseph. and Pádraig Ó Conradh. And remember, we mentioned that Martin O'Kane questioned, would either of these two have been writing in Irish if it was not for Colm na Gaeilge? So, and Marekin Tuan Shin, should they, these are some of Pádraig Ó Conradh's work here, which is also available in the library. Okay, so I hope that makes sense. And for anybody who went through the education system, I don't think you could have missed Scoshgilta in Ireland. I see Fintan, you're smiling there. So so as you can see, they are some of the works that are available in the library. I know I went through that fast, but we could have spent maybe 2 more hours on it, but we'll better continue because I want to get people involved in the conversation, really. Thank you very much, Natalie. Gur míle maith Natalie and Shen. So inis Fintan Sora agus Nancy Gohama Kofadalib agus Ilya Gaeilge. So now we're going to talk more about the Irish language, and I think it's important to get people's personal experiences and the journey the language has meant, because everybody's journey is different and everybody has different experiences. But as I said, tá panel intach ein an seannacht. Natalie, can we stop the share on the screen? Is that, or no? Oh yeah. So anish Fintan, tosa me latsa. So Fintan, Aberlum fwy the Horace godi seo y Merlin nhw'n gael gyda'n rawed sydd agos Nancy yn fyrtagi. So Fintan zita goled osa mas mailet.
Rwy'n mahat Lavinia, ta se gyholing y goni, the chlor y chlystail agos the chanwnt y chlystail agos rusmwch abu, Connemara abu. I think my journey in the Irish language begins long before I was born. My grandmother, my mother's mother, was born in Kerry in 1905. And so right in that time, when the Tomás Bán Ó Concannon was coming and going from the US to Ireland, and before the first Timera, and in the first generation really of Conradh na Gaeilge. And she was sent by her family to boarding school in England. And she came back with no Irish, even though she was a Kerry woman, and she married a guard, a policeman from Clare, who was 10 years her senior, who had fought with the East Clare Brigade in our struggle with the English, let's call it. And she raised 8 children, and my mother was born in 1928, so 2 years after the founding of Radio Éire. And so kind of in the middle of all of what you've been talking about are these, individuals that I, was raised by. And, but the Irish language was anathema in my grandmother's head. She thought that Irish was a backward language. It was associated in her mind with poverty and with disadvantage. And when we say poverty, we don't just mean mild inconveniences, but abject poverty. People living in the 20th century in mud huts. The Black Valley in Kerry was the last part of Ireland to be electrified. Living in really, really, really tough, unsanitary, unpleasant, cold, damp places. And, English, the language in which one would sell a pig, was the language of commerce, the language of trade, the language of maybe not a middle class, but a surviving class that could make it through from one year to the next with most of their children still alive. And she aspired to raise her children with English because she thought that was the best thing for them. And you mentioned, Lavinia, that the psychology and the sociology of the time. My grandmother would say all the time that we have heads like chickens with only room for one idea in our heads at a time. And she really thought that the Irish language would take up room in your brain that could otherwise be used for English or for other pursuits that would be more important. And this is not a nasty person. This is not necessarily an ignorant person. This is a woman of her time and a woman of her generation and a woman of her socioeconomic class. Her people worked on the railroad. They had decent jobs. The railroad, of course, was really kind of a branch of the empire. It wasn't just, a neutral body. It was part of how the British Empire conquered the world, and they were part of that, and they were very proud of their role in that. And they had relatives that fought in the British Army and fought, for the empire over the generations. And they were not alone in Ireland in that. But she raised 8 children, and she didn't want them to speak Irish and to do anything with the language or the culture. And so that's my mother. So my mother then went on to join the civil service. So she was a government employee. And as part of that, similar schemes to the schemes they had for the summer schools, she was sent off by the government to Round the Ferish, to Ranafest, for a month at a time. I think she went like 2 or 3 summers in a row. And they were paid to go on these holidays, basically, to Donegal to learn Irish. And she loved it. And she loved the singing and the dancing and the language itself. And she actually became a beautiful Irish speaker in her own right, but not because of how she was raised, in her own home. And one of the problems, I suppose, that we had with the Irish language in Dublin when I was raised, I was born in 65, so skipping way forward. In 1905, my grandmother, 1928, my mother, and 1965, me. So she was 37 when I showed up. I was an unexpected adoption, apparently. One of the things that was current in Ireland in my childhood was kind of, in people's minds, there was an equation between the Irish language, Irish culture, Irish dancing, Irish games, Irish sport, with the struggle for Irish independence and the IRA. And there certainly was a link between the Irish the Cearta Síolt and the Gaeltacht civil rights movement, and the freedom fighting as regards trying to unify Ireland, the United Ireland movement, the IRA movement, the Sinn Féin movement. Sinn Féin, had always been in support of the Irish language and culture, and but there was a sense, at least among middle-class people in Dublin, particularly among Fine Gaelers, and my mother's family were all Michael Collins supporters, and were definitely on the Fine Gael side historically, or the Clan Gael side. But there was, in their minds, they were afraid of the Irish language and the Irish culture, because it kind of it had associations, let's say, with the IRA and with what they would have considered kind of criminal activity and gang activity, et cetera, et cetera. Now, it's easy, of course, to make judgments looking back, and today we sometimes glorify the IRA, and particularly, I would say, it can happen sometimes among Irish Americans. But for those of us living in Ireland in the 60s and 70s, there were real implications for the IRA. We remember in our little town in Wexford and Gorey, the bank being held up by the IRA. The IRA, raised their money by selling drugs and robbing banks and brutalizing people like every other, paramilitary organization in the world. And so while their goals were noble, their means were not always. And so there was a fear there. And my parents were very much wanted us to be friends with everybody and to be open to everybody. We were raised Catholic, but they made absolutely sure that we had Protestant friends, and that we were not raised, in an insular kind of way in the place where we were living. And so they were afraid of the Irish language being something that would brand you as a separatist or an isolationist or something, and not a modernist. And I think that goes back to my grandmother's thinking too, that the Irish language was associated with something backward and poverty-ridden. And they didn't know the riches of the language or the culture. They didn't know Martin O'Kine. They had read maybe a few books in school or since, but they were really not aware of the culture. And I think that's what the Timmery were trying to do, was to go around the country, not just as teachers, but also as community organizers. They built the movement from the ground up. They went from fireplace to fireplace, and bringing people together and showing them the jewels and the beauty of their culture, and giving them a sense of pride and a sense of identity, which really blossomed, I think, in Ireland in my generation, for sure, in 1990, beginning, when Irish people began to be proud again of their country and to be proud of their identity. When I was a child, if you saw an Irish flag flying outside a house, it meant they were IRA sympathizers. In 1990, when you saw an Irish flag flying, it meant they were supporting the Irish team in the World Cup. And from then on, and maybe not because of that, lots of things happened in the 90s, but there was a lot of pride in U2 and Sinead O'Connor and the Cranberries, and Ireland came on the stage with movies and with a lot of glamour. And there was a lot of pride and an economic revival that allowed us to not just be worried about making it through. Would your children actually live to see adulthood, but would they live in Ireland and see adulthood and raise their children, or would they be educated and raised for the export market, as most of the generations before then were? It was only in the 90s that the 45,000 people who left Ireland every year to emigrate to other countries reversed, and people started coming into Ireland at the exact same volume that they used to leave. So it is true that the language and the pride and the sense of identity are all connected, and it's taken a long, long time, I think, for that to change. I don't think it's completely changed on the island, and if it's true that the Gaeltacht is Tobar na is Tobar na Gaelgaid, if it's true that the Gaeltacht is the well and the source and the spring of the Irish language, I think it's also true that the island of Ireland is too the well of the culture and the language itself. And I think as opinions change in Ireland, the support for the language changes, and the view of the language around the world changes. I was going to say something else and it went out of my head. Just one final piece was just, I cannot underestimate I can't overstate, sorry, the importance of Raidió na Gaeltachta. Not just, it did several things. You talk to old people who are alive today, and they'll tell you that before Raidió na Gaeltachta, a person from Kerry would not understand a person speaking Irish from Kerry would not understand a person speaking Irish from Donegal. The dialects are very, very different. If you were to hear them spoken or to see them written down phonetically, you'd hardly know. Well, Nancy Stenson would know, but the rest of us wouldn't be able to decipher what the hell was going on or what the connection was between them. But because of Raidió na Gaeltachta broadcasting in the four dialects repeatedly, every single day, giving maybe not equal, but fair representation to the dialects, over and over again, I think people began to be able to mutually understand each other, and it really knit the disparate communities, because they had been isolated as little islands, little enclaves. You mentioned Rathcarn, surrounded by English there, a little, not even a county, but just a little smidge in the middle of County Meath. But it's the same is true for all the Gaeltachts. They're all little enclaves, they're all cut off, they're all isolated, and mostly in economically disadvantaged areas, places that are hard to get to. And Raidió na Gaeltachta, without destroying the language or without doing anything negative at all to the language, has somehow managed to bring the communities together, both within the Gaeltachts and also in Dublin, which is the largest city in Ireland, not a Gaeltacht, not always known internationally for its support of the Irish language, but really another cradle of the Irish language and a cradle of learning and of education and technology and advances in teaching and learning and speaking and archiving and all of those things. But Raidió na Gaeltachta has really helped speakers throughout the country, and I would say speakers throughout the world. I know Lavinia tunes in, she tells, I can't say the word Alexa out loud in my house because all my devices will go nuts. But there's a certain lady friend of mine whose name is Alexa and is sponsored by Amazon. And she knows how to turn on Raidió na Gaeltachta in my home at the drop of a hat. And I know she does the same in Lavinia's. And I can tune in at any time of the day, and I can even listen to it in my car. The only problem, speaking, you wanted to hear my personal experience, the only problem I run into listening to Raidió na Gaeltachta in the car is that I tend to move over to the correct side of the road. So I have to be very careful when and where and in what state of mind I am when I'm listening to Reading the Gaeltachta. And TG Cahir, Television na Gaeilge, has also been a huge boon for the language. And it has kind of, in a way, there's no other way of saying it, it's made Irish sexy, whether it's, Dahi himself or the lovely, men and women who do the weather forecasting. It's really made the language attractive and interesting and modern and upbeat and cool, and associating the language with soccer, with sports, with movies, with high energy, high quality, production values, has really done a lot for the language. But what TG Cahir doesn't have compared to Reading na Gaeltachta is Irish to its heart. Irish is the language of its backroom, its toilets, its engineers, the guy who mows the lawn. You can smell the poaching outside in the front lawn in Castle. Whereas TG Cahir has never really been that. English is kind of the language behind TG Cahir. But they've done amazing work, but the heart isn't the same as Reading na Gaeltachta. Anyway, I'll stop talking because I could go on forever. I know Nancy's just bursting to jump in and add her contribution. But Gurmahat Lavinia.
Oh, Gurmila Mahat Fintan, Visheshin, that was just fabulous. I think I could concur with everything you said. I thought it was fabulous. Very, very interesting, and thank you very much. So Nish Nancy, Masha Dehele Store.
Okay, well, I have the Strangeris perspective, the outsider Irish. Although I was noticing a piece from Douglas Hyde's diary. I was looking through some excerpts I have from his writings of his visit to America, and Lavinia mentioned that he kept a diary. And I found this piece, which I thought was a good way to start my bit. He says, "Nur husmeir reid geolam, ni rasule behagam gomachan timente riv na gomachshiana husajum hain." When I started to learn Irish, I was not expecting at all. I never expected that there would be interest in it, nor that I would use it myself. Well, that's my situation as well. I hardly knew there was an Irish language until I was in my mid-20s, and I came upon it and my work in it almost by accident. So the idea at the time I began to study it that I would someday build a whole career around it is still somewhat incomprehensible to me, I guess. Yeah, I started with a graduate school assignment to do a report on Old Irish. So I went to the library, got a book, found it to be extremely weird and wonderful. Did my report, did some further work on it for another class because I was interested enough, but I'd always been oriented toward working with native speakers of living languages using a process linguists call fieldwork. So Old Irish was not going to be my thing, it was clear. Shortly after my first encounter with Irish, I took some time off from graduate school and moved to the Boston area, where I found a community ed class in modern Irish. So I said to myself, oh, let's give this a shot. And that's where I began to study the language. The teacher was a retired priest, an African missionary who'd contracted malaria or something else nasty and had to retire early. And he took an interest in me because he was a bit of a grammar nerd himself, and he loved talking about grammar, and most of his students did not, but he could see that I did. So he started giving me private lessons. I'd go out to the seminary, we'd have dinner, we'd talk grammar, he'd give me things to read, and that was how I really began to get a grip on the language. I then returned to graduate school and had to choose a dissertation topic, and everybody, myself included, pretty much figured I was headed from my first year of study there toward one of the native languages of California and doing field work in that. But I started thinking about my interest in Irish, and I started thinking about the prospect of 9 months in Ireland doing field work or 9 months on a reservation in the Mojave Desert. Well, what would you choose? I considered it something of a no-brainer, and so Irish became my dissertation topic. When I went on the job market, I got lucky enough to find that there was a postdoctoral scholarship on offer back at the Dublin Institute for Advanced Studies, and I applied for it. I had, while studying for my dissertation, been in Rathcarn, the Gaeltacht that both Lavinia and Fintan have mentioned, which is near Dublin. And so I could go for weekends and then come back and use the libraries as I needed to and work with some people in Dublin as well. So I decided I would, because this institute that was offering the scholarship had a long history of doing dialect studies of Irish going back into the 30s. I said, I will do the dialect of Rathcarn, and they gave me the scholarship to my astonishment. So I got to spend an extra year and a half in Ireland and actually kind of begin to learn to speak the language. When I started, that wasn't my goal. When I started, I was going to do this field work, which you often do through the medium of English, and you focus on fine little grammar points so that you don't necessarily gain fluency from doing that kind of work. But everyone in the Gaeltacht assumed I was there to learn to speak the language, because that's why people go from Dublin to the Gaeltacht. And I realized after a not too long time of going down there every weekend that I actually was interested in not just the language, but the people and their culture and their community. And I wanted to get to know them on their own terms, meaning in their own language. And so little by little, I began to develop some fluency in the language, and I was able to make that grow when I got to back for my postdoctoral work. However, when I got my job in Minnesota, it had nothing to do with Irish. I was hired to teach French and linguistics. But I also had some administrative duties that involved meeting the language teachers throughout the university. And when I was talking to the Latin teacher, he asked me about my research interest, and I told him. And he said to me, I have a student who's very interested in Irish. You should meet her when she comes back from study abroad. Well, the next semester, she showed up in my office hours and said, will you teach me Irish? Okay, I guess. I'm not sure how to do that, but I'll give it a shot, I said. I had never considered this possibility before. A week later, another student showed up saying, me too, please. And so we arranged a directed studies. There were no formal courses available, and I had to do this sort of in my own time, but I thought it sounded like fun. So we set up a directed study project for the following September. And by the first week of classes, there were 4 of them come to learn Irish. 2 more had found me. It's kind of like the coronavirus. It just keeps spreading. Bert, Tror, Shakhtar. By the end of, or by some point at the height of this, which went on for a few years, there were 7 students learning Irish with me this way. And then somebody got the bright idea of establishing a real formal course, which I did in the early 1980s. And I have been constantly gobsmacked all the way through at the number of people who show up on the first day of class wanting to learn Irish. Now, I figured, you know, there'd be 3 or 4. There'd be 20, even more sometimes. Now, they didn't last. Attrition was high. It always is in language courses, and Irish is not for the faint of heart. But there were always quite a few, half a dozen at least, most years, who would finish out the year, and some of them just wouldn't go away. They wanted to keep on. So we set up evening meetings to continue with it, and each successive offering brought a couple more people into that evening group. People came and went, and it was very informal. And gradually it evolved from a formal class into a sort of easygoing reading and conversation group. They now call it a salon. It's still going. And some of those very first students are still with us. We now meet on Zoom, but we used to meet in my house, and it was a lovely social evening. Still is, but Zoom, as you all know, is not the same. There have been a number of eye-openers along the way, too. Connections that I found around the same time I started teaching. Another fellow, an Irishman from County Armagh named Dennis Clark, started teaching Irish in a pub in St. Paul. And I went a couple of times, and we got to know each other. And over the years, some of his students found their way into my formal course. And some of my students found their way back there and now are teaching, because Dennis has retired and indeed passed on. So some of my students wound up going back and taking up the teaching in that community course. And then Fintan came to town and started a course at St. Thomas, and a number of times we've taught together at weekends and workshops, one-day workshops and things of that sort. So there's been a lot of interaction among the various groups dealing with Irish. And I kept running into people in my early days here people who had nothing to do with the university or my classes or anything, but I'd meet them at, a party in my husband's office. And somebody would say, well, when I was studying Irish, and I'd sit up and say, you were what, where, when? And they'd, taken a course in Michigan or Missouri or California or somewhere. And I began to realize that there was an enormous amount of interest out there among, well, the classic situation is the third generation of immigrants suddenly want to go back to their roots and learn the language. And that was who a lot of the people were, but not all. I've had students with no Irish blood in them whatsoever. They just like funny languages, and this one is one of the funniest. And we have had a lot of fun working with it. I also discovered when I first started working with it in graduate school still, my aunt told me one day that my grandmother, who had died years earlier, was, to my great astonishment, a native speaker of Irish. Who knew? She would never have admitted it. Like Fintan's family, Irish was the language of poverty. Even her accent in English, if people complimented her on it, she'd be insulted. Because I left all that bog Irish stuff behind me when I came to America, and I don't want to hear about it. So I never knew the whole time she was alive that she could speak Irish, and it was only after she had died that I began to take an interest and learn it, but I've always regretted not knowing sooner. So the language keeps coming around and popping into my life. Even my child, I had a daughter even later in life than Fintan's mother did. And she accompanied me frequently on research trips to Ireland during the summers. So she picked up a few words here and there. I tried to get her an au pair, but that didn't work out. And I was a little too chicken to try and speak Irish to her all the time myself. I tried it for a full day and knew I could do it, but I spoke a lot less than when I spoke English. And I thought, okay, more is probably better than varied. But she picked up some Irish while she was in the Gaeltacht with me over the years. She did a couple of summer camps there. She even chose to study it in college, although she didn't have a language requirement. She had met that with Spanish. She chose to study Irish, and I can't say she speaks it. She would never say so. But she has the couple focal. She has more, in fact, of the couple focal, the few words, than her Irish husband, who grew up in Dublin with a bad attitude toward the language. I think the thing I'm most pleased about is that I have students who've been there with me from the beginning and who are now off teaching and spreading the word and enjoying the language, and that we're all still able to do it together is a source of great pleasure for me now that I'm retired and no longer teaching officially. Okay, a very personal account, but Shine Moshkel agus Gurina Milu Magi as Thanks very much for listening.
Nancy Balo yes Witter Tashin Ko Simul, so interesting. I would listen to you all day. Honestly, it's such an interesting journey, both yourself and Fintan. Goramila Mahagai. So we just have some questions coming in now. So Horda, this is when we're going to invite so you can switch on your cameras if you want, and we invite you. But I'm going to take the first question is for Nancy. Nancy, do you have any tips for Irish as a second language learner, learners who are trying to go from strong beginners learner to a solid, strong intermediate level?
Gaeltacht, Minnesota. One of the Monday night classes at Gaeltacht, Minnesota. Well, once they meet again, I suppose this is not the time to be advising that since the pandemic has put a stop to all that. But
so this person's located in California, so I think
never mind.
The journey might be a bit far.
Well, speaking of journeys, though, what a lot of people have done is to go to Ireland and go to Idit Squale in Donegal, or to go to Acadив na Hoscoilíocht Gaeilge in Carrow. If you let us know, we'd be glad to share those informations with you.
Yes,
There's lots of places, but those two are outstanding.
there are intensive courses in every Gaeltacht, actually.
Yeah.
Well, not Rathcarn, but that's Connemara anyway.
Right.
So depending on what dialect you want to learn, those courses are a wonderful way to do it. Yes.
And then we have another question in there is, it was about the immigrants coming to this country. So we touched a little bit on this, so about why they didn't continue to speak the language once they arrived. Again, I believe that was to do with, you know, as I think Fintan put it, the language was it was associated with poverty. And when the immigrants came to the States, they were trying to get away from poverty and to succeed. And you know, we have the case in Minnesota, as many of you probably know of, is the book Bridget Conley wrote. It gives a good insight to Forgetting Ireland, where people wanted to, you know, they wanted to assimilate and really forget what they had left behind, the poverty they had left behind. And that actually continued up to recent times. I remember being at a wedding in Chicago a number of years back, and I met a man from my home parish, and he never would return because the memories he had were negative. And he, you know, as Fintan kind of, you know, and we mentioned that how things had changed, he hadn't seen that progression, and he had
Right.
the language was associated to him with negativity, and that's why a lot of people didn't, just like Nancy's aunt, etc. And remember, that happened on the reverse. People would return home to the Gaeltacht regions, and they would return home and continue to speak in English to their parents who spoke Irish, and that was a horrendous situation. But the Yanks would come home, and that's how they were treated. And it was an awful situation that they would come home and not speak Irish to their parents, and their parents had no English. And that went on for quite too long, unfortunately. But again, it was that whole thing. Yes, Fintan, right, sorry.
Well, I think it's as true in Ireland as it is over here, that in order to have a vibrant language that passes on from generation to generation, you have to have a community proximus around you. And so as long as there's an enclave, if you look at the, say, Orthodox Jewish communities of New York, or Amish communities, or I live in Cedar Riverside in Minneapolis, which is a predominantly Somali neighborhood. And so you have children and teenagers who were born in America but can speak their language. They can certainly argue in their language because I can hear them from my bedroom. And they have their language, but it's because there's a population that is contiguous, that is around them, and that allows the transmission of culture. And they have cultural institutions such as mosques in which the language is featured. The Catholic Church, unfortunately, has never really been a champion of the Irish language. And the churches that the Irish ended up in Minnesota, there were some churches in southern Minnesota where you might have had a small town that had a German Catholic church for the Bavarians, and an Irish Catholic church for the Irish. But for the most part, the churches, and this is not a criticism, it's more of a sociological phenomenon, were kind of assimilation places where people learned to become Americans, and the goal was to become part of the melting pot, become an American, and to raise your children that way, because that was where success lay. That's where El Dorado was, in that direction, not the other direction. It was go west, keep moving, keep making progress. But there was also clearances in Minnesota, in St. Paul, the very neighborhoods that were the Irish language neighborhoods, just like the Rondo, the black neighborhoods that were destroyed for making the freeway. Those neighborhoods were taken over and redeveloped, and people were moved out. And also, as people moved out of the suburbs in St. Paul particularly, they lost that connection with each other. So the generation that came from Ireland, if they did speak the language, would have spoke the language to themselves, to their relatives, to their peers, but not to their children. And other markers of Irish identity, such as the dancing and St. Patrick's Day and Catholicism, were celebrated and got a lot of institutional support, but the language didn't. And I'm not saying that those are all the reasons, but they were certainly influencing factors in why the language didn't really continue in Minnesota. There was a time in St. Paul where you had to speak Irish to be a policeman, because how else would you break up the fights in town at closing time when the pubs shut down? But that has obviously changed.
Even in Boston, where there is still a very large Irish community, and many of them Irish speaking, though they didn't pass it on to their children, at least not very often. I did a bit of research in New York, Chicago, and Boston some years ago, interviewing people about the question of transmission of Irish and who they used it with and when. And anybody in my generation or older, or even 10 years younger, never said they spoke Irish to their children. Not one. They spoke Irish to their friends. They spoke Irish in the pub, that,
Right.
you know, all among siblings, all the rest, but not to their children. Interestingly, I also interviewed some younger people, people who were then in their 20s or so, 20s, early 30s. This was back in the 1990s, so a new study is called for. Every one of them said, oh yes, they did want their children to speak Irish, and they intended to speak Irish to the children when they had them. Unfortunately, none of them had children yet. So,
Right.
well, there was one couple who did. They had a 2-year-old, and they said, yes, they did speak Irish to him. This was a couple in Chicago. But for the most part, the people who were, you know, raised during the period when attitudes had begun to change, when the economy was better, when they thought they would probably go back to Ireland at some point in their adult lives, they all wanted their kids to have Irish. I've often wished I could do that study again and find out whether any of
What the
them
heck was going on?
did
Yeah.
pass it on. That's another question. But
That's very interesting, Nancy. I just want to let everybody know. So we're going to go over for about 5 minutes, folks, if that's okay with everybody. I know some people has had to leave. We've just had some feedback there from people, and thank you all very much for that. I know some people have had to go, but Nancy, yes, I find that study very interesting, and just I do believe that that what you said, Nancy, seems very accurate, actually. You know, that there has been a change with, I think that has been thanks to, again, as we mentioned earlier, Raidió na Gaeltachta, TG Cahir, as now the language is sexy, whereas, you know, before it was more of a sign of poverty. I do agree with that. So, I just want to look here. There's questions. Are there any developments in teaching in Irish in special ed? And is socializing on Zoom within Ireland tending to make accents more uniform? So just with the accents, so first of all, RNG and TG Cahir have made the languages more uniform, most definitely. We have, first of all, we have what's called, now we've standardized language, okay, which is taught in a lot of schools. But having said that, even outside that, in the Gaeltachts, people connect in the Gaeltachts now. For example, the Oireachtas na Gaeilge I mentioned, people will come together. Once we actually, people from the Gaeltacht regions actually come together twice a year. We come together for Comórtas Pel na Gaeltachta, which is held in June every year, and then we come together for Oireachtas na Saona, which is held in November. So every 6 months we catch up with each other. So that's so we do. And do children of first want them to learn Irish? Well, I have a little boy in my house, and Irish is the only language we speak here, so it is, myself and my husband, and I'm not alone in that. I know that for a fact. I know many others abroad. So I hope that's answering your question. I'm just trying to get to some of the questions there. So far, I mean, I'll let you know if I encounter roadblocks, but I'll be calling Nancy and Fintan if I do that. Let me see. I just want to make sure I get to all of the questions. And socializing on Zoom, yes, socializing on Zoom. The actual developments in technology has happened across the board in every language, not only in English, and they have happened in Irish as well. I mean, we have Twitter, Facebook. Actually, even recently now, you can the phone in Irish. You can buy the phone set up in Irish, so that with your fathers and all ready to go. So just to answer those questions there. So I'm really grateful to everybody for coming in here tonight, and you know, the community here, there always, you know, as Fintan mentioned, there is always a community of, the Irish community in St. Paul was always quite strong, but there's the learners in St. Paul and Minneapolis and in the Minnesota region is still quite strong, and there are many learners, and we get together in different ways. We're blessed. We were hoping to have got together for Deire Seachtain na Gaeltachta earlier in the year, but hopefully we will get that next time round. Hopefully. So I'm trying to just make sure I get to all of your questions.
Lavinia,
there.
I think it's one of the beautiful things about Celtic Junction is that, you know, we have the language and the dance and the music and the literature all in the same place. There are, you know, there are very few Irish community centres in the country where, and it's, you know, where the language is featured as much as it is in Celtic Junction. And I think it's to a large part it's due to Cormac's you know, rootedness in the Irish language. You know, he's known internationally for his dance, but you know, he's a musician, he's a fluent Irish speaker, and I'm not just trying to suck up to anybody here, but he really has done, and Celtic Junction has done us all a great service in promoting a holistic culture and also embracing a diversity locally and internationally too, which is kind of the antidote to what my parents were afraid of, because they thought that Irish was somehow isolating and it's not. It is. It can be the key to universalism. And I love Kate Daly's comment about the Ojibwa culture. There are huge parallels. I work within the Native community here. My boss is an enrolled member in the Leech Lake Band of Ojibwe, and she always introduces me to her elders as this is Fintan. He speaks his language, and they just know when you speak your language that you have a connection to your people, to your ancestors, and they would say to the spirit world that is unique, and they honor that in me. And they also share a history of colonization that the Irish also share, and that is embodied in a language too. The history of a language, like the history of a human body, you know, is evident in itself. You know, the whole history of the Irish language from before the Irish language is evident in the language, the words, the structures, the influences, the scars, the beauty spots that it has inherited over the millennia. And I think that's true too for our other indigenous languages. We see much more in common with our sisters and brothers, and it's a gateway to building human connections with each other, rather than, again, the thing my parents were most afraid of was that it would make us dislike people or hate people. And I must say, as they grew older, they learned to change their ways, and they spent I think 20 summers in a row in Carrow reacquainting, re-embracing the language and relearning the language and speaking it for 2 or 3 weeks every summer at a time, and falling in love with the people of Connemara, which Lavinia will tell you is a hard thing to do.
And I just thank you, Fintan. As I just want to answer there a question Joanna sent in. So are there developments in teaching Irish in special ed? Of course there are, because remember, people in the Gaeltacht have the same, you know, needs and wants as any other community. So yes, of course, tá múnsar fiaush, tá huile sort múnsar takeíocht le fáil sna Gaeltachtaí agus in Gaeilge. Yes, so there are you know, you can get your speech language therapist. We have all of that is available now. And so just answering Joanna's question, and that, so special education teachers are available you know, in across the board with the Irish language. So so I know, folks, we have gone over there a bit with time. I know we've had to say goodbye to some people, but achorta gur míle mahagi as a lenya nocht Thomas fear weachclib Fintan gur míle mahad Thomas fear weachguts agus Nancy gur míle mahagi ID de Peter and Versagi. And was co-buachib. I know near a zero Mary near a sagi care to be, you know, kids even my kinds of militial puishan actor míle mahagi as well in agus a cards a thank you all for joining us this evening, and Natalie, thank you very much for coordinating all of this and keeping us to time and all of the rest. So Sinna will go full credzum. Will in fuckles are noch again. Last word, final word. We always, of course, you know, we're Irish when we say it takes us about 10 minutes to say goodbye, but we'll give everybody a chance to say final word.
It's the Irish goodbye and the Minnesota goodbye combined. So
God help you. You'll be here till 12.
I'll mute myself.
No. Okay.
No, I'd love to say thank you so much. We saw so many class members. Of course, Lavinia teaches Irish here at the Celtic Junction as part of the Irish College of Minnesota classes. We have beginners up through advanced. We're doing the TEG which Lavinia could maybe give us a little mention on before we go. We'll be returning to that. We're one of the few locations that host that certification in the United States. We saw a lot of class folks in there. People who have been involved with the Junction. Of course, we've seen some donors. Thank you so much for being a part of this and for actually supporting and making this happen. You make a huge difference. Board members have been on here as well. We know you're very proud for what you support. Thank you so much for being there. Last thanks again also to Nancy, Fintan, and especially Lavinia. We have to brag about her a little bit because she has really changed what Irish language is here in Minnesota, especially how it's being shared and spread and celebrated and enjoyed. And our dream, of course, is to have Irish soaking up the walls as much as we can. So thank you for making that happen, Lavinia. And we can find our last few words. Just wanted to make sure we recognized everybody before we left.
Gur míle maith Natalie, gur míle maith go léir. So anish go was Frieds on Rod, and thank you for everybody who came and who listened to us tonight, really and truly. Sure, we'd be talking amongst ourselves, but thank you all very much for taking part. So anish Nancy, go mad, lion fuckles are not like
everyone for coming. Go to Mila Magi. Thanks to all my students for sticking with Irish over the years and becoming friends. And thanks to you, Lavinia, for the things you've been doing for the language, to Fintan, to everybody for making the connections that still keep me happy to be an Irish speaker in Minnesota.
Well, Nishif Guramil and Agus and Nancy Gutcha Agus ta almost all were in Gutcha or no, and Mars to Kyangan Kyan Rodi at Shaw, Minnesota, Agus Tigan was Eshin Guriwa, Fintan store.
Oh, I've said it all. I have nothing more to say. I've run out of words.
You've run out of words. We're coming to the end. Well, Gora Mila Mahagi and Natalie, thank you very much there for taking care of us all there this evening online and monitoring all the IT and everything and with the Celtic Junction. And so Mar Dershid or Ska Ikela Warrens Nadini. So oh, wait a while, come master version it. So anyway, we'll all keep in this together and we work together as we go forward with the language, and we'll do what Douglas DeHeeds has said is few I allowed Samala mar a bhí me golará tíor gan tanga tíor gan anamach sure tá me san ás mí ceart le golará le his gorod ach gur a míle maithagí le go chóirde and go gúd is sinna bhfuil go fólín. Ihuahagi.